Ladies and gentlemen, so we're a little bit ahead of our program, which is nice because it means that I will have more time. So once again, my name is Tuomas Martikainen and I will be providing you a kind of like collage, a journey in time into the history of our institute and what migration in Finland is about. But to start with, as we do have some individuals in the audience who might not be aware of the full scope and things of migration in and out and to Finland, so let's have a brief recap of how things are. So I'm looking of approximately the last 150 years. This is also mainly the timing of the issues of which the Institute has been interested about. Not only there are some elements that have a longer history, but primarily the last 150 years. And it's not a coincidence. Why this timing? That time basically is about the transformation from a rural, peripheral, sort of post-middle age area into a modern state. So in the latter part of the 19th century, when Finland was still a part of the Russian Empire, a Grand Duchy in the Russian Empire, we saw the first major wave of industrialization. The growth of industrial cities, which was aided by foreign capital, foreign expertise, and foreign skilled workers in many places. So, for example, the city of Tampere, which is called the Manchester of Finland. In Finnish, it's called Manse, for some reason. So we saw an increasing growth of cities into a new level in terms of their population. At this time, Turku was still the largest city in Finland. It remained so until the latter part of the 19th century. Simultaneously with of this period, let's say from the 1870s until the 1920s, during that time, the population of Finland grew by approximately 1 million people as natural growth, and more than 300,000 people emigrated to the US. So we didn't see a population decline, but rather a population growth in Finland and a great numbers of people leaving to the United States. Of these American migrants, approximately 1 out of 5 returned. And that was of great importance to the development of this country. People brought with them new skills, new technologies, awareness of what is taking place outside in the world. While it's not maybe that much always taken up in the national writing of Finnish history, it's with these international linkages of different types of ideas, technologies, and whatever political ideologies move. And we might also remind us that if we think about ethnic issues in today's world, that the Finnish-American community, which was located mainly around the Great Lakes and a few areas elsewhere, was a highly divided group. What we saw in the internal politics of Finnish Americans was a reflection of what was taking place in Finland. Finland, which highly unfortunately fell into a civil war in 1918, was divided between the bourgeois, let's say more conservative, church-oriented people, and the newly created labor movement, socialists and communists and so on. The same division was there taking place in the United States, even to the extent that sometimes, there are these signs that are sort of half-jokingly taken up these days, but reflect of the reality at the time of people not talking to each other, almost, not going to the same places. There were people who went there and people who went to the otherwise, and this is also in a way carried over generations, but today people can live with this past, which was quite problematic at the time. But anyway, a significant migration to the United States of more than 300,000 individuals, US and Canada in particular. Now, something that I have not put here is the great movement of people during periods of crisis and war. war always moves tremendous amounts of people, as we see currently taking place in Syria, and that was also the same case in Finland. During the Second World War, approximately 10% of Finnish population was resettled within its own territory, so-called Karelian evacuees. Also in my family, I have a history relating to these experiences, as do many other Finns. But after the crisis period of the war, Finland was nevertheless, despite the late 19th century early industrialization, it was a pretty rural society. Majority by far of the people still lived in the countryside. But what we saw starting from the 1950s and to the 1970s in particular was a second wave of country internal mobility, often called the Great Migration in this country, suuri muutto, moving from smaller places, often to regional centers. And again, simultaneously with this urbanization of Finland was the very high-level mobility to Sweden that was lacking workforce. Approximately around 400,000 Finns moved within 2 decades to Sweden. Huge number of them, many returned, again bringing new ideas, innovations of various sorts to here. What I'm aiming to say here is that human mobility is intimately tied up with other changes in society, changes in the economic structure and so on, and they kind of like create a new Finland. Now, the last phase, which we are in a way living now, is the time after the end of the Cold War, when the international order changed. Finland was rapidly developing. It had become a Nordic welfare society and state. We saw a new type of immigration. I'll tell you one example. In many previous times of crisis, people sought through migration an ease to the difficulties of life that they had, whether economical or political or whatever. What happened in the early 1990s, when we had one of the worst recessions in the history of this country, was that people stayed. It would be an exaggeration to say that nobody left, because of course, some people, but the majority of people stayed. And I think this is important. It showed that the wealth of the country and the social support networks that had been created as kind of like modeled around the Nordic welfare state ideals kept. Maybe barely. There was a lot of discussion about financial austerity those days, as we have today. But the Nordic welfare state model survived the harsh times of the early 1990s, and then something unexpected happened. Finland, almost overnight, became a country of immigration. In the early 1990s, the majority of immigration to Finland was Finns returning from Sweden, mostly, and from a few other places. But after that it changed. It had to do with the changing nature of the Soviet Union. So there was a group of ethnic Finns who had moved to the area in the 17th century near contemporary St. Petersburg. They were then, this is a long story, so I won't go into that, considered return migrants were allowed, and kind of like one significant part of people who started to arrive in the early 1990s to Finland were people of Finnish heritage returning from the Soviet Union. Also, the number of asylum seekers started to grow. Finland joined the EU in 1995. New forms of international mobility created. Finns were more wealthy than before. They traveled around. Finnish businesses were growing. The miracle of Nokia in the late 1990s, early 2000 was bringing in people from, from around the planet, basically. And the immigration streams to Finland became highly manifold, and in a relatively short period of time, from very low levels in the initial phase, immigration to Finland grew. Okay. So this is a long story cut short. That is what had taken place during the past 150 years. We will soon move to the Institute and see how all this is reflected in what we have been doing. And by the way of the picture, I think this is an almost universal picture. Somebody's saying goodbye, probably to parents. You know, there's a distinction between a traditional and a modern, an old house and a new car, an old lady dressed in, I don't know, some old-fashioned clothes, and a young boy, you know, looking smart. And that's it. You know, young adults are generally those whom you find as migrants from the age of approximately 20 to 35. That is the largest group basically anywhere. People who are ready to take the challenge of changing, ready to take the risk, and so on. And then the picture of the boat showing, in this case, it's sort of, you can see it's from it's a Viking Line, one of the ferry companies traveling between Finland and Sweden, and its home harbor is Marienhamn, a city in the Åland Islands where the company is housed. So it's about travel between Finland and Sweden. But we would need to change the pictures. We would have in the first picture maybe a horse carriage or a train, and then a picture of a steamship from Hanko, the sort of most southern tip in Finland. Then we would talk about the American migrations, or then we would have an airplane and, you know, some other things. So the means change, but many of the other things don't. The following graph, just to give you an idea of the numbers, it's the best that I have been able to produce so far in how to understand country internal migration and international mobility through one slide. It has two scales. The scale on the left side from you reflects the number of immigrants and emigrants, and it's the black and red lines. And then the scale on the right side from you is country internal mobility, and it's the columns there in behind. So you see that there is a kind of like things are happening at the same time. The data is not perfect. It's from the Statistics Finland. Historical data has always some problems. But anyway, there we can easily see the time scale goes from 1878 until 2017. There we can easily see the great movement to America, the black line, the mobility to Sweden, and how it peaked. I mean, ever since the Hunger years in the late 1860s, the previous time that was the last time before the turn of the 1970s when Finnish population had actually shrunk, and then it was because of death. In the turn of the 1970s, it was because of out-migration. So it was kind of like a generational experience that, you know, you need to go and, you know, at least visit Sweden at the time. It's huge numbers. Now, let us move on. What was the context in which the Migration Institute was founded? Oops. Obviously, migration had become topical in Finnish society with the country internal mobility and mobility to Sweden from the late 1950s. Here we have in this graph Finnish emigration to Sweden by decade, by a 10-year period, and it's the same story as I just told you. There was demand for expert knowledge. There were a few researchers, some studies had been produced of this. There was interest in the ministries, in particular the Ministry of Labor was highly interested of these, and that many of the later committees and other type of governmental developments that have revolved around immigration, international and migration related issues, the Ministry of Labor, or whatever it has been called during these years, is usually always included. And so it's even today. Today, for instance, migrant integration related issues are within that ministry and not in some other ministry. Of course, and then Finland Society, that is a voluntary association that keeps contact with the Finnish societies outside of the country. Suomi-seura is its name. It was also supporting some research, but it was not very widespread. There was interest and public demand, okay, which is very understandable at this particular moment. Then what happened? Wise men. I was looking through, I based most of my presentation in a history book that was published of our institute 5 years ago, and you see a lot of wise men in there, which is in this way interesting, because if you look at today, the people who are doing migration research, it's highly female dominated, but this was a different era. So foundational meeting was held at the University of Turku in March 1974, and in the far left you see two key figures. Professor Vilho Niitema, he was a professor of history at the University of Turku, and then PhD Dr. Olavi Koivukangas, who had done his PhD in Australia on Finns in Australia, New Zealand area, and returned to Finland. So there had been consideration that something would need to be done, and Professor Niitema was the key figure in having the links to the ministries and organizing things and bringing people together. So at the organizational meeting there were 20 organizations present, and 18 were the founding members, and these founding members were all the Finnish universities that existed at the time, 3 ministries, and then a couple of what we might call NGOs, Väestöliitto, the Finnish Family Federation, Suomi-Seura, Finland Society, for example, as well as the city of Turku. So Dr. Koivukangas was also politically skilled, so and I believe that this played a key role in that the institute was also able to get both local support from the city of Turku. The city of Turku still covers the cost of our premises where we are located, and from the Ministry of Education there was a small grant given from the very first days that made it possible. And the other individuals there, you see different participants, so I'm not sure if there are many people in the crowd who actually remember these times, but if there were, you would recognize maybe some faces. About the name. Names are sometimes passionate. Even today we had a discussion about our name in our institute. Because in the Finnish language, siirtolaisuus as a concept is usually referred to sort of mostly associated with historical migrations and sort of overseas migration. You might say that it means like a Finnish emigrant, okay, in many people's minds. It's a generic term in reality. So, for example, the International Organization for Migration, the UN member body these days, uses this concept of siirtolaisuus as a generic term for voluntary international migrants, basically. But in the Finnish concept, it has this dual meaning. But anyway, so there were different suggestions for the Finnish language name. Siirtolaisuuden tutkimussäätiö, Migration Research Foundation, Muuttoliiketutkimuskeskus, Migration Research Center, Siirtolaisuusinstituutti, Migration Institute, Muuttoliikeinstituutti, Migration Institute, in the English language, okay. And finally, the decision was made that this monster of a word, Siirtolaisuusinstituutti-säätiö, Migration Institute Foundation, was created, and originally it was in English Institute of Migration. We changed the name to this current version a few years back by the recommendation of our then chairman, the city mayor of Turku, Aleksi Randell. Anyway, so here we see the original logo. Okay, we changed that, and I maybe tell the story of that. So the original logo was created by a friend of Professor Vilho Niitema, Armas Mikola, an artist, and there we see 3 birds flying. And again, logos are symbols and they create emotions. So there was a discussion that why are they flying to the east? And that question was raised again, that when we made the new version of our logo, it's still flying to the east. Yeah. So the direction of east is a little bit sensitive in Finnish discussion because, of course, refers to Russia/Soviet Union, but the artist is no longer alive, so I don't think we will ever get the answer. So, what were the initial workings of the institute? So these were the humble beginnings, an old Russian garrison, sort of close to the University of Turku area. There's the first building. If I remember correctly, there were 2 people working in the very beginning, creating links with whoever does. A survey was done on what type of migration research is conducted in Finland. They started to publish their own journal, some books, studies, reports of different sorts. Obviously, with 2 or a small handful of people, you cannot really do that much. So it was on a rather low level in the 1970s, but it sort of found its place, as well as started to arrange. For example, this meeting was then for the first time organized in the 1970s. This highly complex chart that I'm showing you is from 1977, and it remarkably well still describes many of the activities that we have today. I know that you cannot really see it that well from there. So in the center we have the Migration Institute. Around it we have coordination of research, sharing information, international cooperation, and monitoring. Okay, some of these activities we still do. Then that is split into 4 main sections, which is documentation and archiving. We do have a large archive. Then research, which is then divided, and I think this is interesting. It's divided into country internal mobility, migration to Sweden, distant migration, referring to US and these other countries, and other. Okay. What is missing from this part are 2 things that have grown to be quite important. On the one hand, research on immigration. I mean, it wasn't an issue because everybody was leaving at the time. And the second one has to do with genealogy support, and I will come back to that a little bit later. Then it continues with educational and other type of cooperation and publishing. Those of you who have background in political science know the concept of path dependency. It simply means, in everyday speech, that what has been done before influences the way how things are done afterwards. And I see a lot of path dependence in the Institute all the time. Sometimes we are struggling with it, sometimes we are very proud of it. But a kind of organizational self-understanding is always necessary, so we just don't do things because they were done before. Here are 2 examples of the publications. The Siirtolaisuus Migration Journal. We are a trilingual organization, so we work in Finnish, Swedish and English, mainly in Finnish and Swedish. Luckily in Swedish language, migration is the same word, so we don't need to have 3 words in the cover of the journal. And then in 1978 was published the first bibliography of the existing research that they were able to catch up. It's called Suomen siirtolaisuuden ja maassamuuton bibliografia. The bibliography of Finnish emigration and country internal migration. So quite typical things, new ways of doing things, and we need to catch up what previous generations have done. And also, this year we aim to publish again a bibliography. So, there are certain things which keep simply coming back. Now, let's say the 1970s were the founding, the beginnings. The next 2 decades kind of made the Institute. And it included also a moving to a new location. That location is not too far away from the place where we are at the moment. So we are at the heart of the historical old Turku city. And this place is maybe, 700, 800 meters probably from here. Today it's in a different usage. It's a faculty building for arts of the Åbo Academy University, but for 20 years the first floor of that building that we see there was the use of the institute, and there we also see from the opening ceremony we see a few people in the two in the middle in the first row. It's Mr. Olavi Koivukangas and Professor Vilho Niitema, the same guys we saw in the previous picture, and then in the center, in the middle, in the back, the second from the left, there's Dr. Ismo Söderling, who later became the director, and so on. Not going through all the individuals, but those of you who have been working with the institute see that, you know, if you get your feet between, you know, the door, so who knows who gets lucky one day. So the institute was growing. It had established itself. It was kind of like, you know, found its profile. And beside the research that I have made some mentions here, emphasis was on expanding the archive. We have quite a large archival collection. It's mainly based on donations and then some other material we have purchased. There's a library. We have been engaged in having exhibitions of different sorts and support for genealogists, and I'll say a few words of that in a minute. Now, just in order to get an idea of the scope of our activities, I have put here a kind of like a historical chart of the development of our economy, and that's in the current money value so that we can compare it. So thinking of today's world, we started out in the 1970s with having an annual budget between 200,000 and 300,000 euros, okay, contemporary money value, and that grew gradually so that when we come to the turn of the 2000s, it had kind of like quadrupled or five-folded the sort of annual spending, which of course means that there were more people involved in it, and it's a kind of like indicator of what takes place. Then there was a little bit of hiccup at the turn of the 2000s. Won't go into the details of that, but we see that it settled, you know, around 1 million euros, a little bit under, for most of the past 20 years. And now, since the last few years, we have been growing very significantly, so that actually this year we have almost doubled the level of the 2000s, which is not visible in this graph yet. And that has primarily to do, in this recent case, about external financing. Anyway, maybe we should reflect a little bit, and this is a good moment for it to think that what type of places these migration institutes are. So I have moved around Europe. I have many colleagues. We belong to different type of networks where people from somewhat similar places meet. So in my understanding, we have two most common types of migration institutes in Europe. On the one hand, we have centers that are usually affiliated with university. And most of these places look at contemporary immigration to Europe. Most of these places. There are a few exceptions that have some other type of profiles and so on. And this is the so-called IMISCOE network that we have currently. But there's another type, and that another type of institutes or kind of like centers are usually associated with museums and archives, sometimes as independent organizations. And their research profile or their working profile is quite different. They are interested of exhibitions, you know, usually the great European American migrations play a central role. They have support for genealogists, for example, the new migration museum in the city of Gdansk. No, Gdynia in Poland is one example of those. Ellis Island Museum in New York is another, maybe the most well-known of its kind. So in order to understand the profile of our institutes, it's good to recognize that we incorporate elements of both of these, what I consider quite basic types. And this is rather uncommon. It's usually either or, you know, a more historical interest, including support for genealogists in particular, or then a more contemporary research oriented. There are a few other, of course, there are many types of institutes, but but so on. But director Koivukangas, he was director for a very long time. What is it? More than 30 years, I believe, altogether. So he had created through his work and interest on migration museums and collecting and historical artifacts and so on. So he was gathering many kinds of material around the world. And then when we go across the 1990s, then also immigration comes to the picture. But now, with the growth of the institute, a research director was appointed, and many of you know Elli Heikkilä, who she is here greatly enthusiastic, also sitting here in the audience today as a newly arrived person. And before her there was a Kalevi Korpela, who then moved elsewhere. But appointing a research director simply says that there was more research that was done at the institute. Events there are, again, if you look at the picture to the left, there you see our current board member, Professor Veli-Matti Ritakallio, as a student participating in an event in the 1980s or 90s, I can't recall exactly this year. And there you see these type of exhibitions that were made, bringing out historical artifacts of different sorts, which is very common in migration museum type of milieus. Now there was also a technological change that took place over this, and it's of course, we have forgotten it, but it's the time of the typewriters. Maybe we can just make a small test that how many of you have actually used in your own work typewriters. Yeah, so the younger ones don't remember it anymore, but the rest of us do. So I think we are all quite happy with computers actually. So, and here we have the first Mikromikko computer that was purchased to the Institute in 1986 or 7. I'm not sure which year it was, but still, far away. And, by the Nokia company. Nokia was then developing, doing work in electronics, which later became a completely different type of story. But about genealogy, so coming back to that issue, so Mr. Koivukangas remarks that already during the first year of activity in 1974, they started to get queries of people looking after their relatives, and it sort of was. It was not planned, it was not intended to be an original area of interest, but it kind of like naturally grew because of the type of collections that the Institute was having and the type of expertise that its staff had. So genealogists maybe found the Institute and not the other way around. So there were different versions in kind of like aiding this work. It was very difficult work. I talked with our now retired genealogist, Elisabeth Ushanov. So she told about the early days. So you were actually happy to find any information, and if you could find any information, it was basically a name, on a passenger list. That was about how it was. Today, the situation is completely different with the availability of data in many forms. You may actually be able to track quite accurately the comings and goings of these individuals and may find, plenty of information of particular individuals. So, in any case, there were plans to create an electronic, what is called the migrant register, which they started planning it in the late 1980s, and then it came out in an online version in 1999. And it's one of those issues that we are still having, and it's also one of our most used services. Obviously, the audience is quite specific that are it, and it's also something that we want to be able to provide in one way or another in the future. Mr. Koivukangas himself, coming from Ostrobothnia, which is also the historical region of which the great majority of, in particular, America migrants from Finland left. So if you go to any village there, basically you will find local history associations and people knowing quite a lot about that. It's also the area where there's a particular interest in American cars, for example. So of course part of the heritage. So a small regional center was created in the municipality of Peräseinäjoki in 1994. Which aimed to do much of the same things as the activities here in Turku, but with a regional focus in there. A major project of the Institute was creating this 6-volume history of Finnish emigration. 2 of the volumes deal about North America, 1 about Latin America, Asia, Africa, Australia, 1 of Sweden, 1 of Russia, and 1 about Europe. So it took a long time to get it finished, and there we see a picture when it was finally done. You see these gentlemen here look very tired. 12 years of hard work, and now it's the final book has come out. Now let's move to more contemporary times again to figure out that what has happened. This is Finnish immigration and emigration from 1990 to 1217. That is divided by the citizenship of the individuals. The columns below basically show you that Finnish nationals have migrated on relatively low levels during the past almost 30 years, between 5,000 and 10,000 individuals annually, and there's the situation is so that approximately 1 out of 10 of those Finnish citizens who leave the country remain outside of the country, the rest return. But the bigger change is when we look at the foreign nationals arriving to the country. So we see it was, for a decade approximately on the same level as with the Finnish nationals, but it has risen quite a lot during the past about 20 years and still continues to rise. And the difference with foreign nationals immigration to Finland is that most of them stay in this country. So approximately 3 out of 4 or 4 out of 5 remain in here. The rest, it's a small minority that leave. Now let's look at the 2000s. Again, a new premise in Linnankatu, closer to Turku Harbour. There was a fire in the initial stage. Most of the activities stayed pretty much the same as in the 2 previous decades. There was some adjustment to the place. And then 10 years ago, we moved to a new place, and there we see the handing over of key. I actually don't know where the key is now at the moment. So Professor Koivukangas retired and handed over to a new director, Ismo Söderling. So what took place then was kind of like modernization of the idea. This is just symbolizing it, maybe more kind of like a new type of leadership, sharing more responsibility, bringing people together, creating different sorts of teams to work in. And they will see another thing. Kruunupyy, what on earth is that? Okay, I will come to that in a minute. Mr. Söderling is, I think his greatest asset is that he's very sensitive to things that happen around. So one of the most well-known studies that the Institute has done, probably alongside the migration history work, is the so-called Närpiö study. Närpiö is a very small, mainly Swedish language municipality in Finland that produces most of the tomatoes and cucumbers in this country. Okay. By the way, the origin of the tomatoes and cucumbers go back to the US, where returning migrants took the seeds with them and created this business. Anyway, and they have been producing all these agricultural things, but they had labor shortage. And they were kind of like successfully dealing with it with immigrants. And it was considered that, how on earth have they succeeded in this little place in the middle of nowhere, which is also famous for that if you talk the local dialect, nobody understands you. Okay. So there was a study done about the so-called Närpiö model. Again, another different type of, maybe bringing more about the immigration back into the picture. So there was produced a book of young Somali boys living in Helsinki region, writing about kind of like, telling about their own lives by means that they have created themselves. And there was an exhibition based on photos that they took. So two examples of, immigration interest. Again, here a picture of the archive. This is from our previous location. This picture you see, it has been a big collection. We have, for example, 15,000 letters sent for migrants. In earlier times, people used to do that. Plenty of photographs, interviews, all kinds of things, journals. You ask, you will have it. Now, another new thing, John Morton, I don't know who knows John Morton, but he was one of the signatories of the US Declaration of Independence. He has Finnish roots, sort of through Sweden, and it became a kind of, maybe wrong to say a local celebrity, but at least local celebrity for a number of historically oriented people in our field. So we started to give out an annual award in honor his legacy, and there you see 4 eminent people who have worked in our field who got the prize in 2014 or 15. A big festival was arranged here in the city 8 years ago, Suomi Sydämessä, Finland in our hearts. Participation of kind of like ethnic Finns from different countries of the world. And activities were also taking place here, by the cathedral and around this area where we are staying. The city of Turku mayor at the time was highly interested in supporting this because it, of course, brings tourists to the city. So the city gets its money's worth of supporting the institute. Now, Kruunupyy. Now let us return to this. So. To cut a long story short, there was interest to to look in particular about the migration patterns of the Swedish language citizens of Finland, who are highly overrepresented among Finnish immigrants, for example, 2-3 times overrepresented in comparison to their population size. So Mr. Magnus Enlund there, together with Mr. Kjell Herbert, were the sort of launching figures behind this, and the activity started in this house in one room in Kruunupyy, sort of north from here on the western coastal area of the country. So we have 2 regional centers now. The second one established 5 years ago. Now, I have been a director since 2015, and it's sort of a bit embarrassing myself to think, what we have been doing here, but just to give you a few ideas. So there's been a big generational change in our staff. A lot of new people coming in various ways. We had an immense growth in external financing that has given us also resources to do different kinds of things. We have entered the world of peer-reviewed publishing. That was done in a different way before. It's kind of like also gives a little bit more maybe academic credibility to the things that we do. And then we had the new logo and visuals, and the rest is just a few things. Now we moved to new location 2 months ago, just on the other side of the street. Organize events. We are participating in the Turku Book Fair. There was a launch of a new project that took place at our institute just recently. We're working as a team. We want to develop our skills. This was from our spring trip to Helsinki earlier this year with a great program. So that's maybe so much about the last few years. And just a final slide, and then I will finish. If we look now a little bit to the future, what is it that we may expect? It's pretty certain that migrations will continue. Large cities seem to be the main beneficiaries, but there are, of course, other, there can be and will be regional variation in this, but this is how it seems. Migration flows will most likely remain quite mixed. I think that's the sort of the main feature of the last two decades, maybe in particular. We see increasingly more complex and mixed migration flows, and also in their reach. and that also implies a diversification of population in Finland. There we have a chart by Nordregio, a great research institute in our area, sort of highlighting the areas where they estimate that will be the main sort of beneficiaries of migration until the year 2030. And for the institute, so we will, this is our aim, play a crucial role in knowledge creation in the Nordic countries as a significant hub of migration knowledge. That is where we are heading and where I believe we already are. Thank you.